Welcome back, everyone. In our previous lecture, we explored how the war on drugs emerged in the 1970s under President Nixon, examining its political motivations, racial dimensions, and early implementation. Today, we're moving into the 1980s, a decade when this war escalated dramatically, forever changing American society. The 1980s represented a pivotal intensification of drug prohibition policies. If the 1970s laid the foundation for the war on drugs, the 1980s built a fortress on that foundation, one that would imprison millions of Americans, disproportionately people of color, in the decades to follow. Part 1: The Reagan Revolution and Drugs. As the relatively progressive drug policies of the Carter administration gave way to the Reagan era, America witnessed a dramatic shift in drug policy approach and rhetoric. In 1980, the reform momentum of the late 1970s still seemed promising. NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, was conducting groundbreaking research on addiction as a biomedical condition. Carter's administration was considering federal marijuana decriminalization, and treatment and harm reduction approaches were gaining scientific validation. The election of Ronald Reagan changed everything. The new administration immediately signaled a dramatically different approach to drugs. Quote, "We're taking down the surrender flag that has flown over so many drug efforts. We're running up the battle flag," said Ronald Reagan in 1981. In 1982, First Lady Nancy Reagan launched her Just Say No campaign, which became the centerpiece of the 1980s drug prevention efforts. The campaign was characterized by simplistic messaging that reduced complex social problems to individual choice, school-based programs like DARE, the Drug Abuse Resistance Education Program, celebrity endorsements and media partnerships, focus on abstinence as the only acceptable approach. And while well-intentioned, research would later show most of these programs had minimal impact on actual drug use rates. A Rand Corporation study in the 1990s found that treatment was 23 times more cost-effective than Just Say No style education in reducing cocaine use. So Reagan dramatically expanded federal drug control efforts. In 1982, he established the Vice President's Task Force on South Florida, headed by then Vice President George H.W. Bush. This position of drug czar was informally created to coordinate enforcement. Military assets were increasingly used for drug interdiction. The DEA's budget increased from $86 million in 1981 to over $382 million by 1987, and the number of federal drug prosecutions doubled between 1982 and 1988. This militarization reflected Reagan's preferred framing of drugs as a national security threat rather than a public health issue, leading to unprecedented cooperation between military and domestic law enforcement. The Reagan era saw two crucial legal changes that would define the modern war on drugs. First was the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, which eliminated federal parole, established sentencing guidelines, and expanded asset forfeiture powers, which basically means that you can have your property taken from you and if you were even suspected of dealing or having drugs. And even if you were proven innocent, you still have them taken from you. This is still a problem to this day. And second, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, 1986, established mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, including the infamous 100-to-1 disparity between crack and powder cocaine penalties. Under these laws, a person convicted of possessing just 5 grams of crack cocaine, which was associated with black users, received the same mandatory minimum sentence as someone with 500 grams of powder cocaine, which was associated with white users, hence the 100-to-1 disparity. By the time Reagan left office in 1989, his administration had shifted massive resources from treatment to enforcement, established harsh sentencing regimes that targeted urban communities, created powerful anti-drug bureaucracies with vested interest in continuation, transformed public discourse about drugs through powerful rhetoric, and deeply embedded drug enforcement in American foreign policy. As we'll see throughout this lecture, the consequences of these shifts would be profound and long-lasting. Part 2: The Media, Moral Panic, and Crack Cocaine. No discussion of 1980s drug policy would be complete without examining the crack cocaine epidemic and the moral panic it generated, a panic often inflamed by sensationalist media coverage. Crack cocaine, a smokable, cheaper form of cocaine produced by cooking powder cocaine with baking soda, emerged in American urban centers around 1984 to 1985. Several factors contributed to its rapid spread. First was economics. Crack could be sold in small, affordable doses in $5 to $10 rocks. Second was accessibility. Smoking eliminated the needle barrier that limited cocaine use. 3, intensity. The smokable form produced a more intense but shorter high. 4 was marketing. Innovative distribution networks targeted new customers. And finally, 5, urban decay. Economic disinvestment in inner cities created fertile ground for these kinds of for abuse and despair, quite frankly. While crack cocaine was genuinely destructive in many communities, the media and political response was disproportionate and often racially charged. So in 1985, major news outlets began running dramatic stories about crack. Time and Newsweek both declared it as the issue of the year in 1986, with cover stories featuring ominous images and dire warnings. Perhaps the most damaging media narrative was the crack baby phenomenon. In 1985, Dr. Ira Chasnoff published a small study of 23 babies born to mothers who used cocaine. The media transformed this preliminary research into apocalyptic predictions. NBC claimed America would have a biological underclass due to crack. The Washington Post warned of a generation of, quote, biological inferiors, and CBS called these infants, quote, the most disadvantaged group of babies ever born. Later, more rigorous research found the effects of prenatal cocaine exposure were far more subtle than claimed and often impossible to distinguish from effects of poverty, poor nutrition, and lack of prenatal care. However, the damage was done. The stereotype of the, quote, crack baby had entered popular consciousness and fueled punitive policies. Media coverage of the crack epidemic was deeply racialized. Inner-city black users and dealers were portrayed as violent and predatory. Similar rates of drug use in white communities received far less coverage, however. Coded language about, quote, urban and inner-city problems became common, and black communities were portrayed as passive victims rather than people responded actively to a crisis. Studies of television news from this period found that black people were shown in handcuffs or prison settings 4 to 5 times more often than whites in drug stories. White experts explained problems in black communities, and coverage focused on enforcement solutions rather than addressing root causes. So politicians quickly responded to and amplified this media panic. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act was passed with unusual speed following the cocaine-related death of basketball star Len Bias. Political ads increasingly featured imagery of urban decay and crime, and both Democrats and Republicans competed to propose harsher penalties. Notably, the Congressional Black Caucus initially supported tough crack laws, believing they would protect black communities. Many would later express regret as the disparate impact became clear. The media-fueled moral panic around crack provided political cover for the massive expansion of punitive drug policies and contributed significantly to racial disparities in enforcement and sentencing. Part 3. International Dimensions, Drugs and Covert Operations. While domestic drug policy was becoming increasingly punitive, American foreign policy in the 1980s became deeply entangled with international drug trafficking, sometimes in ways that directly contradicted stated drug control objectives. The Reagan administration dramatically expanded, quote, source country programs aimed at eradicating drug production abroad. These included crop eradication programs in the Andes, training and equipment for foreign military and police forces, intelligence sharing and joint operations, and economic incentives for governments to prioritize drug control. By 1989, the U.S. was spending over $2 billion annually on international drug control efforts. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the 1980s drug policy was the Iran-Contra scandal and its drug trafficking dimensions. In this complex scheme, the Reagan administration secretly sold arms to Iran, and proceeds were then used to fund the Nicaraguan Contras who were fighting the leftist Sandinista government, and many Contra groups and leaders were actively involved in cocaine trafficking. So evidence suggests that U.S. officials were aware of and sometimes facilitated this trafficking. In 1989, the Kerry Committee, the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Terrorism, Narcotics, and International Operations, issued its conclusion. Quote, there was substantial evidence of drug smuggling through the war zones on the part of individual Contras, Contra suppliers, Contra pilots, mercenaries who worked with the Contras, and Contra supporters throughout the region. U.S. officials involved in Central America failed to address the drug issue for fear of jeopardizing the war efforts against Nicaragua. In effect, aspects of U.S. foreign policy were actively undermining domestic drug control efforts. In 1996, San Jose Mercury News reporter Gary Webb published, quote, Dark Alliance, a series alleging connections between the CIA, Contras, and the spread of crack cocaine in Los Angeles. While media organizations and the CIA disputed many specifics of Webb's reporting, subsequent investigations confirmed core aspects. That the Contra supporters were involved in drug trafficking, that U.S. agencies overlooked this trafficking to support the Contra War, and that cocaine from these networks did, in fact, reach American cities. The controversy highlighted the contradictions inherent in 1980s drug policy, with one arm of government waging war on drugs domestically while another turned a blind eye to trafficking by political allies. Though formally launched in the 1990s, the groundwork for Plan Colombia, a massive military aid package ostensibly for drug control, was laid in the late 1980s, as the U.S. developed models for military approaches to drug control, aerial fumigation programs, which aim to eradicate the plants themselves, merging counterinsurgency and counter-narcotics objectives, and using drug control as justification for broader geopolitical goals, which is something, again, we still see today. This approach would become the template for American drug control efforts abroad for decades to come. Part 4. Mass incarceration begins. The most profound domestic legacy of 1980s drug policies was the beginning of mass incarceration, a dramatic expansion of the prison population driven largely by drug offenses. The statistics are staggering. The U.S. prison population nearly tripled between 1980 and 1990. The number of people incarcerated for drug offenses increased tenfold, and by 1990, nearly 1 in 4 prisoners was serving time for a drug offense compared to 1 in 16 in 1970, and federal prisons became dominated by drug offenders. This explosion was not driven by increased drug use. In fact, overall drug use declined during this period. Rather, it was the result of deliberate policy choices. Several specific policies fueled this growth. First, mandatory minimum sentences. The 1986 and 1988 Anti-Drug Abuse Acts established lengthy mandatory sentences for drug offenses. Second was sentencing guidelines. The U.S. Sentencing Commission established guidelines that reduced judicial discretion. Third was elimination of parole. The Comprehensive Crime Control Act eliminated federal parole altogether. 4. Three strikes laws. Beginning in Washington State in 1986, states began implementing three strikes laws, which essentially means that once you've committed 3 crimes, regardless of what their size or caliber or anything like that, your third crime, you get sent away for life, which is absolutely insane. And finally, 5, asset forfeiture. Expanded civil asset forfeiture gave law enforcement financial incentives for drug arrests. Like I said earlier, this means that even if you were suspected of a crime that involved drugs, you can have your assets seized, and that obviously, when that's a possibility, that gives a huge incentives for law enforcement to find reasons to suspect you, right? So, the birth of the prison industrial complex. As prison populations exploded, a new economic reality emerged, what critics would call the prison industrial complex. Prison construction boomed. Over 1,000 new facilities were built in the 1980s. Rural communities competed for prisons as economic development. Private prison corporations emerged, such as the Corrections Corporation of America, which was founded in 1983, and prison labor became increasingly valuable to corporations. Several corporations still use this today. Starbucks does. There's a few others. I'll see if I can link it when I'm done with this video. So by the late 1980s, powerful economic interests had developed a stake in continuing tough drug policies regardless of their effectiveness. The racial inequalities in drug enforcement that began in the 1970s intensified dramatically in the 1980s. By 1989, black Americans were being arrested for drug offenses at rates 5 times higher than whites, despite similar rates of drug use. In some cities, over 90% of drug arrests were of black or Latino individuals. The 100-to-1 crack/powder cocaine sentencing disparity disproportionately impacted black communities. And by 1990, black men had a 1 in 4 chance of serving time in prison during their lifetime. These disparities reflected both the design and implementation of drug policies. Enforcement focused on open air drug markets rather than suburban dealing. Resources concentrated in neighborhoods with limited political power, and media portrayals shaped public perceptions of who used and sold drugs. The human cost extended far beyond those incarcerated, such as families lost breadwinners, children grew up with incarcerated parents, ex offenders faced permanent barriers to employment and housing, entire neighborhoods saw their social fabric disrupted, community police relations deteriorated, and political power diminished through felon disenfranchisement. Sociologist Loic Wacant has described these effects as creating hyper-ghettoization, where incarceration and community instability create a self-reinforcing cycle of disadvantage. Part 5. Resistance and Alternatives. Despite the punitive turn in official policy, the 1980s also saw significant resistance and the development of alternative approaches to drug issues. As the HIV/AIDS crisis unfolded in the 1980s, it became clear that needle sharing among injection drug users was a major transmission route. In response, activists developed, quote, harm reduction approaches. The first U.S. needle exchange program was established in Tacoma, Washington in 1988. Underground exchanges operated in major cities after that, and outreach workers developed peer education programs. Further, European harm reduction models began influencing ours in America. While the U.S. government resisted these initiatives, often criminalizing syringe exchanges and other harm reduction efforts, grassroots activists pressed on. Groups like ACT UP and the National Harm Reduction Coalition began shifting the narrative that drug use, like any other risky behavior, could be managed more effectively with public health strategies rather than punishment. Ironically, it would take decades for harm reduction policies like naloxone distribution, supervised injection sites, and drug decriminalization efforts to gain serious traction in America, many of which trace their origins back to the desperate creativity of 1980s activists. By the late 1980s, cracks in the dominant narrative began to appear. Reformers and critics increasingly argued that drug addiction is a health issue, not just a criminal one. As sentencing disparities in mass incarceration were tearing communities apart, and civil liberties were being sacrificed in the name of drug enforcement. Organizations like the ACLU, the Sentencing Project, and a few bold members of Congress began planting seeds for future reform, even though they were largely drowned out in the, quote, tough-on-crime hysteria of the decade. Some key milestones include, in 1988, the Drug Policy Foundation, which is a precursor to today's Drug Policy Alliance, is founded. In 1989, critical academic works like Michelle Alexander's early legal analyses began laying groundwork for future arguments about systemic racism and mass incarceration. And underground and alternative media, from zines to public radio, increasingly gave voice to drug war skeptics. It would take another generation for these critiques to reshape mainstream public policy debates, but the resistance was born in the Reagan years. Conclusion: the 1980s, a decade of damage, denial, and deeper divides. By the end of the 1980s, the war on drugs had fundamentally transformed America, not by eradicating drug use, but by reshaping the nation's institutions, policies, and social fabric in ways that we are still struggling to unravel today. It wasn't just a war on substances, it became a war on communities, a war on civil liberties, and in many ways, a war on truth itself. Mass incarceration surged, driven less by rising crime than by carefully constructed laws and policies that disproportionately targeted Black and Latino Americans. Entire neighborhoods were hollowed out by aggressive policing, harsh sentencing, and the economic devastation that followed incarceration. Police became militarized, not just in equipment, but in mindset. SWAT raids, no-knock warrants, and the rise of zero-tolerance policing policies became normalized under the guise of fighting drugs. Public health took a back seat. Addiction, trauma, mental illness, complex human issues that required care and treatment were framed instead as moral failings to be punished with jail time. Foreign policy became deeply compromised, with drug interdiction efforts often serving as cover for Cold War agendas, while the U.S. government turned a blind eye, or worse, actively enabled drug trafficking when it suited larger geopolitical goals. The media amplified fear, hysteria, and racial stereotypes, fueling public support for policies that devastated entire generations. Narratives about crack babies, super predators, and urban decay justified brutal crackdowns and excused the abandonment of inner city America. And perhaps most insidiously, hope itself was systematically attacked. The chance for real compassionate drug reform, the harm reduction models, the health centered approaches, the possibilities glimpsed briefly in the 1970s, was crushed under the weight of political ambition and public fear. When Reagan left office, he handed off to his successors a nation imprisoned not only by walls and bars, but by ideas, deeply ingrained beliefs about crime, drugs, race, and punishment that would take decades to even begin to dismantle. The 1980s were not simply about fighting drugs. They were about redefining the American social contract: who was protected, who was punished, and whose lives were deemed expendable. As we move forward into the 1990s in our next session, remember, the foundation of today's carceral state, racial injustice, and fractured trust in public institutions were not accidental. They were designed. And understanding how they were built is essential if we hope to ever build something better. And to close, I'd like to share a quote adapted from Johann Hari. The opposition of addiction isn't sobriety, it's connection. And the opposite of war isn't peace, it's understanding. So thank you so much. We'll see you in the next lecture.